All right, let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Leanne Foster, and I am a provider outreach and education specialist here at WPS Government Health Administrators. And again, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on ground ambulance provider enrollment. I do want to start with our disclaimer. So the material presented today is accurate as of today. As you all know, Medicare changes often, so please make sure that you are always reviewing official CMS communications, which include the CMS and the WPS GHA website for the most up-to-date CMS rules and regulations. Today's material was developed utilizing current CMS regulations, along with questions that came in from you, pre-submitted questions during that registration process. I will be answering questions today that come up also using current CMS regulations. Photographing, screenshotting, and recording of this education for profit-making purposes is prohibited by CMS. As you heard me say moments ago, I have started recording this session, so that recording will be made available to you on our YouTube channel as soon as possible after today's session. This is going to allow you to view it again or share it with anyone who was not able to attend but might find this information helpful. I'll start with our agenda for today. So today we are going to be focusing on the provider enrollment process for ground ambulance suppliers. We will talk through eligibility requirements for ground ambulance services, along with how to properly complete the provider enrollment application for an ambulance service, which is the 855B. We'll also talk through the documentation that's required for ambulance suppliers and tips for avoiding development requests when submitting that application. And not just tips for an initial enrollment, but also tips for when you're submitting, these tips will help when you're submitting a change of information or revalidating your ambulance service suppliers. Revalidation has restarted post-pandemic, so you are going to start seeing those requests again. And so we'll talk through some of that. I do want to, again, just stress we are focusing on the provider enrollment process for ambulance service suppliers. However, if you would like more information regarding ambulance billing, I am going to encourage you to check out our ambulance playlist on our WPS GHA YouTube channel. And Mary has placed a link for that in the chat so that you have that. Recently, we have held several webinars on the various aspects of ambulance billing, and those will be helpful to you if you're looking for that type of information today. So I want to start with a brief overview of ambulance suppliers. So ambulance suppliers must meet certain basic requirements regarding their equipment and their personnel. So they do have, vehicle has to meet certain requirements, the equipment on that vehicle has to meet certain requirement, and the personnel requirements vary based off of the type of ambulance service that you have. Now, a lot of that is incorporated into the licensure process for an ambulance service. So as we go through this and get into enrollment, you're going to notice that we may not be looking for more information regarding especially the equipment and the personnel, other than that license, because the state regulatory bodies are doing those inspections and ensuring that the ambulance service is meeting those requirements. They have similar requirements to us. Once they get through that process, they will license the ambulance. And typically what we are seeing are licenses that are for basic life support or BLS or advanced life support or ALS. We do also see specialty care transport, but typically that is also incorporated into that BLS or that ALS license. We're not seeing a separate license for that. Next, I want to talk about the difference between a hospital-based and a non-hospital-based ambulance. Ambulance services, like I said, can be either non-hospital based or hospital based, and they are different, and how they enroll is going to be different. So for an ambulance service that is non-hospital based, they are generally private owned, or they could be owned by a local government. So for example, you may have a city or a county or any type of municipality that has a volunteer fire department. These will be the type of ambulance services that we're focusing on today, because these are the ambulance service types that typically need to enroll. So when they're non-hospital based, these providers are going to bill their services to Part B, and they are going to enroll separately as an ambulance service provider. In order to enroll, they are going to submit a CMS 855B, and from that process, they are going to receive a provider transaction number, now also known as a PTAN. Now, they are going to have to get a National Provider Identifier, or an NPI, in order to apply for Medicare. Typically, they will get one NPI per tax ID. And that needs to be reported on that CMS 855B application as that comes in. Now, hospital ambulances are different. They're typically owned by the hospital or that facility. And when the hospital or facility has the license to operate as an ambulance service, those services are typically reported by that hospital, part of that cost report. So in this situation, the services are on that cost report, and because that is essentially billing to Part A, they are not going to enroll in the Medicare Part B program. Now, if you have an ambulance that maybe is under the tax ID of the hospital, but the hospital doesn't necessarily hold the license, that could fall into the category of non-hospital based. But when it's owned by that hospital, owned by that facility, they will not enroll separately, and they will not get a PTAN assigned. So a lot of it has to do with how those services are going to be billed. If you are billing to Part B, you are going to enroll using a CMS 855B. If those services are going to be included in the hospital services and in their cost reporting, you are not going to enroll that ambulance separately through an 855B. And you will never enroll an ambulance service for a hospital-based ambulance with an 855A. That 855B is the only application an ambulance is ever going to complete. Next, I want to talk about PTAN assignment. So ambulance services are a little bit different from your typical group practice. Typically with a group practice, PTAN assignment has a lot to do with location. It has a lot to do with fee localities. For an ambulance service, they are issued one PTAN per state because they have their point of pickup and their point of drop off. It's really hard for that to be billed based off of a fee locality. So what CMS has done is structured it so that an ambulance supplier is only assigned one PTAN per state. Now, you might run into situations where an ambulance may work in communities where a state border runs through it. This happens a lot to us in some of our J5 states, St. Louis, Kansas City. You may have an ambulance service provider that's serving the entire city, and in turn, they're serving multiple states. They will need to be enrolled in each state where they are providing services. So it is possible for them to have multiple enrollments, but they will only get one PTAN per state. That PTAN is going to encompass all of their reported locations, and we'll talk about practice locations, what's considered a location for an ambulance service in a few minutes. When we're enrolling an ambulance service, There is a maximum of a 30-day retroactive effective date unless there is a presidentially declared disaster, which generally allows us to go back 90 days, but that has to be, we have to be notified by CMS that we're going into that situation. Also, the PTAN is going to be designated either basic life support or advanced life support. And that is based off of that state licensure that we have received that classifies the ambulance service and that licensure based off of the vehicle, the services that are being provided on that vehicle. Do they have EMTs or do they have paramedics? What's that personnel look like? And so we will make that indication. And it's an indication that really designates an advanced life support service. If that designation is not there, they are considered basic life support and can bill for basic life supports services. And we are looking at that state license. So it's very important that when you're submitting these, you're submitting the state license that has that service level designation on it. If it's not there, our provider enrollment area will develop and reach out and ask for that to ensure that we are setting up that ambulance service at the proper level. One other thing that I do want to point out about that license level, this doesn't happen all that often, but it can happen. That license level can change. And again, it has to do with the vehicle, the services that are provided, the personnel, and the state could initially license a service as a basic life support, but later on, perhaps circumstances, equipment, personnel, that's all changed, and now they're upgraded to advanced life support. That is something that actually can be changed. We can change that licensure level versus assigning a new PTAN. And the same thing happens if we have one that is maybe downgraded from basic life support, or excuse me, advanced life support to basic life support. If that occurs, that is something that comes in as a change application, and we would need a copy of that license in order to make that change. So now that we've covered some of the basics of just an ambulance service, I want to focus more on how an ambulance service is going to enroll. We're going to discuss enrollment for ambulance services that are non-hospital based. Again, remember, I said if the services are being billed as part of the hospital, as part of their UB04, the 837I, or on their cost report, the hospital-based ambulance is not going to enroll in the Medicare program. However, if they're billing separately or they're a non-hospital-based ambulance, they are going to need to submit an application form, and that is what we're focusing on here. First, you're going to need to be conscious of the fact that an ambulance service provider is a provider that is required to pay an enrollment fee. Enrollment fees are required for only certain providers. We're not talking generally clinics, it's usually facilities and suppliers, and they need to pay that before they submit their enrollment application. If that fee is not paid at the time that they're submitting that enrollment application or before we receive that, our provider enrollment area is going to develop for that fee, and that will cause a delay. Those fees are required for initial enrollments, so ambulance services enrolling for the first time, either with Medicare or the jurisdictional state, revalidations, which is a process of revalidating all information on the enrollment file every 5 years. That does require an enrollment fee. And changes. Now, with changes, it is very specific to one type of change. An enrollment fee is required for ambulance suppliers when they are adding a new practice location that is going to increase the number of practice locations on file. So if they had 5 dispatch and vehicle garage locations and they're now going to add a 6th, that is a scenario that would require an enrollment fee. If they had 5 locations and they're removing one of them, they're going down to 4. That does not require an enrollment fee because it is not increasing the number of locations. If they have a move, if they have 5 locations and they're closing one and moving to a new location, but their number of practice locations, dispatch and vehicle garages, is going to remain at 5, that is not an increase of practice locations. So that does not involve an enrollment fee. The key here is if they are doing a change that increases the number of practice locations reported on the file, they will need to pay that enrollment fee. For 2024, the enrollment fee is $709, and typically around end of October, beginning of November, they start announcing what the new fee will be for the upcoming year. This doesn't change mid-year. I've never seen that. It does typically go up a little bit. It is based on the Consumer Price Index, and CMS sets that fee. This fee must be paid electronically. We will not accept cash or check, money order, nothing of that nature. It does have to be paid, as they'll put it, by plastic card. There is an option to do more of an ACH through our outside of Pecos, and we'll go to that link here in a minute. So to pay it electronically, it is part of the enrollment process. So when you're in Pecos, if you are submitting your application electronically through the provider enrollment chain and ownership system, so again, Pecos, it's going to ask you questions for initial enrollments, revalidations, and those changes that are going to increase those number of locations. It's going to ask you if you've paid your enrollment fee, and if not, it's going to help facilitate that enrollment fee. However, if you're doing a paper application, or you've submitted the application and you're now being asked to pay that fee, there is another option, and it is our external payment system, and there's a link provided for you here. I am going to go ahead and show you that. So this is the website that link will take you to. And it is going to lay out exactly what we just talked about. Institutional providers that are submitting applications, and it runs through those enrollment reasons. Again, that initial enrollment, that revalidation, and that change of information that adds to the total number of practice locations. It is going to then tell you what year the fee is, and it's going to give you the amount. Now, one thing I do want to point out, this is more of an end of year issue than it is right now. Right now, the amount is $709. That fee that is paid does need to be paid for the year the payment is being made. So as you get towards the end of the year, if you pay the fee in December, you're going to pay the 2024 fee. If you do not submit the application until 2025, sometime in January, you are going to get a development for you to pay that 2025 fee. So make sure that as you're paying that fee, you're submitting that application in turn right after. This is, again, only an issue usually end and beginning of the year. If we get the fee in one year and the application in another year, we've got to make sure the fee is for the year that application's coming in. And to pay that fee, I'm not going to be able to go all the way through the process. This is the live system, and obviously I'm not going to run through paying that fee. But paying that fee is relatively simple. It's like online shopping. So it's going to ask for some information. It's going to ask for the MPI, the legal business name, and the tax ID. It's going to ask for the specialty. Now, this I always caution people on, because this particular specialty drop-down has not been adjusted to only include, for supplier types, to only include those suppliers that would pay a fee. The one exception that is on this list is it does have clinic group practice. This does not mean that clinic group practices need to pay that fee. Obviously, we're talking about ambulance suppliers here, but just make sure that you're selecting the appropriate supplier from here. And then it's going to ask for an email address. It's going to ask for the state. And then as you go through and it does the state, let me do that quickly. And I apply. And I'm missing a few things, but it's going to be asking you for which contractor. And this is really important. The next page is going to ask you to start completing payment information. So credit card information, or debit card, whatever method you happen to be utilizing to pay that fee. But again, it has to be electronic, can't be cash or check. It'll add that 709 to your card and walk you through those processes. But filling out this information is very important because what's going to happen, it's going to be submitted through PACOS to the MAC, even if you're submitting a paper application. And that's going to allow us to match it up to your application submission. You will also receive a confirmation email, and it is handy to print that off or take a scan of that and upload that with your application submission, and include that so that we have that. That just helps us match them up. For submitting of the enrollment application for the ambulance service provider, again, you've paid the fee, now it's time to submit that application. And your submission options are twofold. You can either submit electronically through PACOS, which I highly recommend because, again, that processing time is much quicker than the paper CMS 855B, but you do also have that option. And I've provided a link to both here. I'll always stress the submission of applications electronically through PACOS for a multitude of reasons. One, it's going to be hard for you to miss any information. It's not being necessarily verified as you enter it, but all of the required fields are being validated that you've provided that information so that we have it. So you won't be missing information. Also, the processing time on an electronic application that requires no development is 15 days, whereas with a paper application, because that has to be physically mailed to us, scanned, and then ingested into our workflow system, that is a 30-day processing time, so it's significantly quicker. Also with PACOS, revalidations are significantly easier because all of your information will be there if you've submitted electronically before, and you can just confirm the information, and revalidation goes a lot smoother for you if it's submitted electronically. So as I go through this, I'm going to talk about filling out the CMS 855B for an ambulance supplier. And I am going to show the electronic and the paper sections as we go through so that you can see the comparison and that they're asking for that same information. So I also want to point out that I am focusing on ambulance supplier sections or sections where sometimes there are questions about what needs to be there, not every section of the 855B. So the first thing is designating that ambulance supplier specialty. So in PACOS, you're going to see that in the form of a drop-down list, and that is going to populate all of the fields required, including attachment 1. Whereas with the paper application, it's going to tell you to complete all sections, including attachment 1. So this is where we run into some discrepancies, or I shouldn't say discrepancies, but we run into need for development because sometimes there's some confusion where an ambulance service will report certain information versus a mobile unit, and we're going to focus on that today. So sections 1 through 3 for an ambulance supplier are very much the same as any other supplier. Where things start to become different is section 4A, and this is the practice location. So on the left image, you are going to see the questionnaire that you're going to be provided in PACOS, and it's going to ask if you're about to enter a location that is a practice location, a base of operations, or both. By selecting both, it just minimizes some of your entry. On the right-hand side, you're seeing section 4A on the 855B, the physical paper form, and it's going to ask for all of the practice location information, and it's important that you're providing a physical address, not a PO box, in both PACOS and the paper application. And then on the paper application, you're going to be able to indicate the type of facility. Now, oftentimes you're going to probably run into the need of selecting other for an ambulance service. And that's because of the types of addresses that are going to be reported here. So the addresses that need to be reported on all ambulance service applications, electronic or paper, include dispatch locations. So any location where you dispatch personnel or vehicles, even if it's a garage, we need that address listed on the application. We'll also need, if there's a base of operations that's separate from those dispatch locations, we need that information provided here as well. The next sections I want to talk about are 2E and 4F, and there's going to be a little bit of duplication here. So for 4E, it's asking for base of operations. I just told you to throw that in section 4A, and you do need to put that there. You can only have one base of operations, and it may be the same as the practice location. So if you have one location, that's where you do your dispatch, that's where the vehicles are housed. When you get to section 4E, there is a checkbox that is allowing you to skip this because you're telling us that the practice location, or excuse me, the base of operations is the same as the practice location in 4A. That works really, really well if there's only one location. If there are multiple, and this is where we run into challenges on initials and revalidations and oftentimes have to develop. If you have 5 locations listed in section 4A and in 4E you are checking the box that your base of operations is one of the practice locations, we have no way of knowing which one is the base of operations. So if you're listing multiple addresses in 4A and one of those addresses is also your base of operations, which it will be, we are going to need you to fill this out so that we know which one. Now in PACOS, it's going to be a little bit cleaner because we're asking that question about, is it a practice location, is it a base of operations, or is it both? PACOS will make that designation for us. So that's really just a challenge on the paper applications. Next is section 4F. This is vehicle information, and oftentimes we'll see ambulance suppliers fill out this section of the application. You're working too hard. This is intended for mobile units. Ambulance services will report their vehicle information in that attachment 1 that we talked about a little bit earlier. So here you would not complete section 4F if you are an ambulance service. I don't want anyone to duplicate efforts. Type of vehicle and the vehicle identification number will be requested in attachment 1 along with some additional information, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. That is the reason for the separate sections. So 4F, yes, you have vehicles, but for ambulance services, vehicles are not reported here. If they're reported here and not in attachment 1, on a revalidation, on an initial, we will request that that vehicle information be completed in attachment 1. Next, I want to talk about ownership for ambulance services. So Section 5 and 6 of the CMS 855B are intended for ownership. Section 5 is how you will report any organizations. This could be a parent company, but it could also be a primary governing body in the instance that you have a government-owned ambulance service. This happens a lot, specifically in situations where we have maybe a volunteer fire department. So that information is reported in 5. For Section 6, this is where you report any individual owners, if there's ownership, any managing employees, and anyone who's going to be an authorized or delegated official that's going to be able to sign for the application. Now, if it's government owned, things are just a little bit different. If it's government owned, we're not going to ask that, say, a county board member or city council, whomever that governing board is, we're not going to ask that all of those elected officials are placed on the application in Section 6. For government-owned, we are looking for the managing employees and whomever that authorized or delegated official or officials are going to be. It could be the same people, it could be a couple of people, but we're really just looking for that managing employee information and the authorized and delegated official. Again, that primary governing body is reported in Section 5 and will need to provide us with some documentation. So for a government-owned ambulance service, the governing body is going to need to provide us with a letter, which is the image that you see on the right of this slide. It's an example of the letter, and the letter needs to include confirmation that that governing body is going to be legally and financially responsible in the event that there is any fraud or debt or monies owed to CMS. So we're not looking for that individual oversight. We are looking for that government body to say, yep, whoever is part of this governing body is going to be legally and financially responsible. And then reporting those managing employees and authorized and delegated officials in Section 6. Now, this does need to be on letterhead of that governing body. So city of, county of, whatever it happens to be. And it needs to indicate the name of the governing body and that they're going to be legally and financially responsible. There's not a standard template for this. However, most oftentimes, we see letters that include the verbiage that is in the instructions for Section 5 for government-owned entities as part of their statement. So that's a little tip. This would need to be included with initials and revalidations or reconfirming all of that information, and it will need to be uploaded or submitted with your application. It also needs to be signed by that authorized or delegated official that represents that ambulance service and likely is on that governing body as well. So from there, after 5 or 6, we're looking at billing agency information, which is Section 8. We'd still need that in contact, but nothing's different there. The application is obviously going to be signed by the authorized and delegated officials, but again, nothing is different there for an ambulance service than it is for anyone else. Attachment 1 is typically where we see a lot of development and we see a lot of questions. So in Attachment 1, if you are submitting electronically through PACOS, you're seeing what that's going to look like in the topics list of your electronic submission. The only way to get this is if you have selected ambulance service supplier when you're filling out the questionnaire to start the application, if it's an initial enrollment. If it's a revalidation, you have to make sure that you're going into the enrollment for the ambulance service. Sometimes we'll see situations where there's a tax ID that's being used for different types of suppliers. And maybe they're not going into the correct enrollment record. An ambulance service to get a different enrollment record in PACOS from any other supplier or entity under that tax ID in PACOS, and that's for billing adjudicate or claims adjudication and billing reasons. So you've got to make sure that you're in an ambulance enrollment or you're selecting that as the specialty. That will populate the 4 sections that you see here, which is the transport type, geographic service area, state license information and vehicle information. On the right, you're seeing attachment 1 on the paper application, and we'll go through each one of these sections, but attachment 1 on the paper application is 3 sections and excuse me, 3 pages, and all 3 pages are required, and this will be for initial enrollments, this will be for revalidations, and any changes that impact, say, the license, the service area, the vehicles. So the first section of attachment 1 is the type and geographic location. Again, on the left, you're seeing what the screens look like when you are filling out this information in Pecos, and on the right, you are seeing what it looks like in paper. So the first thing that we need to know is transport type. And what we're looking for here is whether or not it is a non-emergency ambulance or it's an emergency ambulance, or if you are reporting both. So the non-emergency would be that specialty care transport if you have that going on. The second portion of that is going to be the geographic area. So we do need to know the geographic area for an ambulance service. This can be changed, so you'll see the change, add, and remove. And again, this is typically something that we'll see. You do have 2 sections, one for initial reporting or additions. So if you're making an initial enrollment, there's maybe some changes that need to be made. If you're revalidating, this will need to be completed. We will not assume what is on file is still correct. That's the purpose of revalidating, is reconfirming everything that we know, accounting for everything currently on file, along with any changes that have occurred. So you may also see with revalidations the need to delete something that's currently on file. Here you'll list the city and town, the county, the state and territory, or specific zip codes. This could vary depending upon your ambulance service. You may not always list the entire state. Maybe it's just a city and town within the state. Maybe it's only certain zip codes of that city and town and state. Maybe it's particular counties and zip codes. So again, it just depends on what your geographic service area is for that ambulance service. Now, you're including that are reported. So it is possible for it to be the entire state, especially when there's multiple locations. So again, it just depends. Keeping in mind, if it's multiple states, that's multiple enrollment applications. Next, we'll talk about state license. So again, on the left, you're seeing what the section will look like in Pecos. On the right, you're seeing what it will look like with a paper application. And this is, again, something that can be changed. Perhaps you've gone from basic life support to advanced life support, or vice versa. So the question is going to be, is this ambulance company licensed in the state where services are rendered for? Yes or no? Most often we see yes. Occasionally we will see no, and if it's no, you'll need to explain why. If you are not licensed in that state, that is something that could require further review and could potentially require CMS input on whether or not that provider is going to be enrolled. We don't typically see a lot of these. You are licensed to provide that service, but sometimes you see in say there's been some type of natural disaster, say there's been a hurricane or earthquake or something, it could be that temporarily you're going into an area to help. That's an example of where we might see a no. So we are going to need the license number, issuing state if applicable, typically it is, issuing city or town if applicable. We don't see a whole lot of that. If you are practicing with a state license, you do not need to list an issuing city or town. Then we need the effective date, and we do need that expiration date. That is something that we do need to see, so make sure you're filling out both of those sections. The expiration date typically isn't always on that license, so if we don't have it, we may be developing asking for that information. So if you know that, make sure that you're putting that there. And that is not something that we necessarily have a method of verification with source data, meaning those licensure boards for each state. Some states were able to do that, some states we are not. So make sure that you're including that to avoid any kind of delays. The other thing with that license is that is, as I said, going to identify that service level, basic life support or advanced. And if there is advanced life support, you are going to receive that designation that allows you to bill at that advanced life support level when those services are rendered. Next, we're going to talk about vehicle information, and this is where an ambulance service will report the vehicle information, attachment 1, not back in section 4. You will need to list all vehicles that are being used, and we're talking about ground ambulance, we're not talking about air ambulance today. So all ambulance vehicles, and they will need to be reported individually. So in PACOS, you're going to have an add another option or add information option. On a paper application, you are going to need to copy this section and complete it once for each vehicle. And this is another thing that a change could be submitted for revalidations. You'll need to account for all vehicles, current vehicles, and if there are any that are being removed as part of that revalidation. We won't just take them off. You'll have to tell us when they were decommissioned, if you will. So we are going to need the type of ambulance. So is it an automobile? Is it an aircraft? Is it a boat? We are going to need that vehicle identification number. And this is that VIN number that's on the vehicle registration. It's scratched into various areas on the vehicle. We are needing that long number. We're going to need that model, the make, and the year. Now, there's no limitation to the year of the vehicle. The state is inspecting for making sure these vehicles are in proper working order and able to provide services. But we need to confirm the vehicle as part of your ambulance, and that's why we're asking for that. We are also going to need copies of the vehicle registration. The ambulance service license might list the vehicles depending on the state that you're practicing or providing services in, but we actually need the vehicle registration for all vehicles reported on the application. Deletions are a little bit different, but if you're adding it, or if you're reporting it as a current vehicle on a revalidation, we need that registration information, or that copy of that registration. We will develop for it if it's not attached. We have no other way of getting that. So please make sure you're providing that. And for each vehicle, we're going to ask about service level. Are they ALS? Are they BLS? And what type of runs are they doing? And it's not uncommon for one vehicle to do multiple runs. They might be doing emergency runs, specialty care transport. The one thing you won't have is you're not going to have a land and an air, or land and marine, or air and marine. So when you get down to land, air, and marine, you're typically only going to select one. It is possible to say yes to multiple for the service level and the types of runs. But that does need to be reported for each vehicle. So the documentation that we're going to need when these are being submitted, either for an initial or revalidation, and sometimes a change. State license, we need that for initials. We'll ask for that for revalidations. We'll ask for that if something has changed regarding the license. If nothing has changed regarding that license, we're not going to need it. Vehicle registrations, again, if you're adding a vehicle or you're reporting that vehicle on a revalidation, we're going to need a copy of that registration. We'll need tax ID documentation. We're going to need a signed copy of the paramedic intercept agreement if one exists. This is something that CMS requires us to have on file. You're not required to have one, but if one exists, we need a copy that is signed by both entities. So again, that's just something that's on file. Business license if one is required. If one is not, and then you can include a statement just indicating that a business license is not required for your city county or state government to operate. That is different, so that is something that we are asking the providers to provide that information, because we don't have that information for, especially when you get into local municipalities. So copy of that business license or a statement indicating one is not required. Payments will be made electronically to ambulance service providers, so we will need the CMS 588 electronic funds transfer agreement to set up that direct deposit. On revalidations, we do not need this if nothing has changed regarding the account information. If something has changed regarding the bank or the account, or say the tax IDs changed somewhere along the way, you're running into different scenarios, we're going to need a copy of that. And then CMS 460 participation agreement. Ambulance services, before I check in for some questions here, ambulance service providers are going to be subject to site visits. They are required, and this is going to be required for basically everything that you're listing in 4A as a practice location. So we will go to vehicle garages, we will go to all of the dispatch locations, and we will go to the base of operations. Now, certainly we realize, especially if we're dealing with maybe a volunteer fire department, something that's not staffed, there may not always be somebody there. Typically, these are site visits that require the inspector to prove that the site is operational, that it is an ambulance service, and they'll take some pictures. However, when you're submitting the application, if there are special instructions, if the inspector needs to speak to somebody, maybe it's a call, or these are the hours that we staff this site, include those with your application. Site visits will happen for any new locations that are being added, regardless of whether it increases the number of sites. A new location is a new location. It'll also happen for revalidations and then initial enrollments. So any additional information that you can include that would make that site visit easier, they are still unannounced, but we do recognize sometimes staffing situations are going to be different with an ambulance supplier. So that additional information helps ensure a successful site visit. Because if for some reason that site visit fails, that can delay the enrollment and possibly lead to denial of the application, and we want to avoid that as much as we can. We're really just looking that those sites are operational and exist. Here, you're going to notice in the materials today, I've also included some resources for you. We do have a WPS article on ambulance enrollment that has links to a lot of helpful information, PACOS, the application, the paper 855B itself. I've also included some information regarding the application fee that is located in Chapter 10. You'll also find information about the site visits there if you need that. And then I'm also including the Code of Federal Regulations reference 410.40 for ambulance service coverage. With that, I'm going to check in with Mary. Mary, do we have any questions in the chat?
We have one question. Is the ambulance enrollment a separate application from the group, or can you add the ambulance enrollment in with the group 855B?
Excellent question. It is separate, and it needs to be separate because its record is set up based off of that ambulance service supplier specialty, and that's critical for the claims adjudication. So it would be, if you have a group and you have an ambulance service that are under the same tax ID, that ambulance service is a separate 855B enrollment.
That's it for questions at this time, Leanne.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So that ends our presentation for today. On behalf of myself, Mary, and everyone on the GHA Provider Outreach and Education team, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time today. We look forward to those survey comments, and please be sure you're including any topics you'd like to see in future education. Again, thank you very much. Have a great day. You may now disconnect.